When the waitress's blood touched the vampire king, an ancient Soulmark appeared. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The chandelier above the grand ballroom glowed like captured sunlight, scattering warm reflections across polished marble floors that cost more than most people earned in many years. Emily Carter tried not to look up at it. Looking up meant thinking about how out of place she was. And thinking about that usually made her hands shake. Tonight her hands absolutely could not shake. The silver tray she carried held crystal glasses filled with dark red wine. Each bottle behind the bar cost more than the rent on her tiny apartment in Queens. Emily moved carefully between the tables of wealthy guests, her black serving uniform pressed perfectly, though the fabric was already beginning to feel heavy against her shoulders after a long shift. Most of the people in the room barely noticed her. To them, she was simply part of the background. Another waitress gliding quietly through a world of silk dresses and tailored suits. But Emily noticed them. She noticed how the guests spoke in calm, confident voices. She noticed the way security guards watched every corner of the room. And she noticed something else. The cold ones. She had worked enough private events to recognize them now. The guests who never touched the food. The ones whose smiles never quite reached their eyes. Their movements were too smooth. Too controlled. Like predators pretending to be polite. People whispered about them in the kitchen. Some said they were powerful investors. Some said they were politicians. Others lowered their voices and said something very different. Vampires. Emily did not know if she believed those rumors. But she knew this much. When those guests entered a room, the temperature seemed to drop. And everyone suddenly became very careful with their words. Her supervisor appeared beside her with the speed of someone who had been watching for mistakes all night. Table 7 needs refills. Do not spill anything. The man sitting there is Lucien Voss. Emily felt her stomach tighten. Even she knew that name. Lucien Voss was not just another rich guest. He was the host of the entire evening. A man whose wealth and influence reached across cities and governments. People described him with many words. Brilliant. Dangerous. Untouchable. Emily forced herself to breathe slowly as she approached the raised table in the center of the ballroom. 5 guests sat there, all dressed in dark, elegant clothing. But the man at the head of the table drew every eye in the room without even trying. Lucien Voss looked no older than 30 years old. His hair was black and perfectly neat. His suit was cut with the quiet precision of extreme wealth. Yet it was his presence that made Emily hesitate for the briefest moment. His skin was pale like marble kept in shadow. His eyes were a strange silver gray that seemed to absorb the light around him. When she stepped closer, those eyes lifted and rested on her for a single silent second. Emily felt a sudden chill run through her chest. Wine refill, sir, she said softly, hoping her voice sounded steadier than she felt. Lucien gave the smallest nod and returned his attention to the conversation at the table. Emily reached forward with the bottle. Her hand moved carefully over the crystal glass. For a moment, everything seemed perfectly normal. Then somewhere behind her a guest shouted in anger. Emily flinched. The bottle tilted. The glass slipped from her fingers. Crystal shattered against the marble floor. A sharp piece of glass sliced across her palm before she even realized what had happened. Pain flashed through her hand, and a single drop of bright red blood fell from her fingertips onto the pale skin of Lucien Voss. The entire room froze. The shattered glass continued to slide across the marble floor with a thin scraping sound that seemed far too loud inside the frozen ballroom. Emily Carter did not move. The sting in her palm burned sharply where the glass had sliced her skin, but the pain was suddenly the least important thing in the room. Her eyes were fixed on the single drop of blood that had just touched the pale wrist of Lucien Voss. For a brief second, nothing happened. The powerful guests around the table stared in silent confusion. One of the servers near the wall gasped quietly. Emily opened her mouth to apologize, but the words would not come out. Something was wrong. The air itself felt heavy, as if the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. Then Lucien Voss slowly looked down at his wrist. His expression did not show anger. It did not show surprise either. It showed something much stranger. His silver-gray eyes narrowed slightly, as though he was watching something impossible unfold directly beneath his skin. Emily followed his gaze and felt her heartbeat stumble. At first, she thought the light from the chandelier was reflecting strangely across his hand. A faint golden shimmer moved beneath the pale surface of his skin. But the shimmer did not fade. It grew brighter. The shape beneath his wrist began to change. Thin lines of glowing gold slowly traced themselves across his skin, like ink appearing on invisible paper. Someone near the table whispered a single word that carried across the silent hall. Impossible. The golden lines twisted together, forming an intricate symbol. The design looked ancient and unfamiliar, yet strangely precise, as though it had been carved by something far older than anyone in the room. The mark spread across Lucien Voss' wrist in a slow, deliberate pattern until the entire symbol burned with a quiet, steady light. Emily did not understand what she was seeing, but the reaction around the room told her everything she needed to know. Several guests stood up at once. Chairs scraped loudly against the floor. A woman in a dark red gown stepped backward as if she had just witnessed something dangerous. "That is not possible," she said in a sharp breath. Another man leaned forward, staring directly at Lucien's hand with pale horror in his eyes. "Soulmark." The word slipped from his mouth like a warning. Emily felt a cold wave travel through her chest. She did not know what a soulmark was, but the way everyone reacted made it sound like a disaster. Lucien Voss still had not spoken. His gaze remained locked on the glowing symbol spreading across his wrist. The golden lines finally stopped moving and settled into a perfect circle of strange ancient shapes. For a moment the room remained completely silent. Then pain suddenly surged through Emily's injured hand again, but this time it was different. The pain did not come from the cut in her palm. It came from deeper beneath her skin, like heat spreading through her veins. Emily gasped softly and looked down at her own hand. The small cut across her palm had begun to glow with the same faint golden light. At first she thought it was her imagination, but the light grew brighter with every passing second. Thin lines slowly appeared across her skin, tracing the exact same pattern that had formed on Lucien's wrist. Emily's breath caught in her throat. The symbol burned gently into her palm until the glowing mark fully appeared. Her fingers trembled as she stared at it. She had never seen anything like this before. Around the ballroom the reaction turned from shock to open panic. Several of the elegant guests moved farther away from Emily, as though she had suddenly become something dangerous. A tall man with silver hair leaned toward Lucien and spoke in a tight whisper that everyone nearby could still hear. "My king, that mark cannot exist. The last record of a soul mark appeared centuries ago." Lucien Voss slowly lifted his eyes from his wrist and looked directly at Emily Carter. For the first time since she had approached the table, his expression changed. The calm control in his face cracked slightly, revealing something deeper beneath it. Not anger, not fear, recognition. The glowing mark on his wrist pulsed once with warm golden light. The identical symbol on Emily's palm answered with the same pulse. Across the silent ballroom, one truth began to settle over every witness in the room. Whatever had just happened between the waitress and the vampire king was not an accident, and it was only the beginning. No one moved after the final pulse of golden light faded from the marks. The grand ballroom of the Lucent Crown Hotel remained frozen in a silence so heavy that Emily Carter could hear her own heartbeat echoing inside her ears. The glowing symbol on her palm slowly dimmed, but it did not disappear. The mark remained etched into her skin like a brand made of light. Emily stared at it in disbelief. Her mind struggled to understand what was happening. Just moments earlier, she had been nothing more than a tired waitress hoping to finish her shift without another mistake. Now every powerful person in the room was staring at her as if she had suddenly become the center of the universe. Across the table, Lucien Voss remained perfectly still. The golden mark on his wrist no longer moved, but its presence changed something in the atmosphere around him. The air felt colder. He slowly rose from his chair. The simple motion carried a quiet authority that rippled through the room. Conversations died before they could even begin. Every vampire in the ballroom watched him with the same uneasy tension. Emily realized something she had not fully understood until that moment. Lucien Voss was not merely a wealthy host. He was the center of power here. When he stood, the entire room reacted as if gravity itself had shifted. Lucien lowered his gaze once more to the glowing mark on his wrist. His voice when he finally spoke was calm, but carried the weight of absolute command. "Explain." The word cut through the silence like a blade. A tall man with silver hair stepped forward from the cluster of guests near the table. His dark suit moved with quiet precision as he approached the king. The man bowed his head slightly before speaking. "My king, there has not been a confirmed Soulmark in many centuries. The last known record was lost during the old wars." The man hesitated as his eyes flicked briefly toward Emily. "But the law of blood remains clear. When a Soulmark appears, it binds two lives together under ancient magic." The whisper of fear moved through the crowd like a cold wind. Emily felt the weight of those words crash into her thoughts. Bind two lives together. She looked down again at the glowing symbol on her palm. The idea sounded impossible. She did not belong to this world of ancient laws and strange magic. She barely belonged in this room. A woman in a deep black gown suddenly stepped forward from the edge of the gathering. Her pale face was sharp with anger. Her voice rose with controlled fury. "This cannot be accepted." She gestured toward Emily as if pointing at a dangerous animal. "That girl is human. A servant. The ancient laws were never meant to bind a king to someone beneath our bloodline." Several others nodded in agreement. Another man spoke quickly. "If the bond is real, then she becomes a political threat. Every house in this court will fight to control her." A third voice followed, with colder logic. "Or to eliminate her before another house can claim the bond." Emily felt the color drain from her face as those words settled into the room. Claim her. Eliminate her. They spoke about her life as if she were a piece on a game board. Fear tightened her chest. Instinctively, she stepped backward. The movement was small, but several eyes immediately followed her. Lucien Voss turned his head slowly toward the arguing nobles. His expression had become colder than the winter air outside the ballroom. The faint golden mark on his wrist seemed to glow brighter, as if responding to his rising authority. Silence. The single word carried a force that instantly crushed every other voice in the room. No one spoke again. The nobles lowered their gazes. Lucien then turned toward Emily Carter. For the first time, she saw the full intensity of his eyes focused entirely on her. They were not simply silver. They burned with a deep crimson light beneath the surface like embers hidden beneath ice. Emily felt her breath catch in her throat. Lucien studied the glowing mark on her palm. Then he looked back to the identical symbol on his own wrist. His voice softened slightly, but the command within it remained absolute. "Bring the royal scholar. If this mark has returned, then the court will learn exactly why." The silver-haired advisor bowed his head at once and moved toward the exit with swift, controlled steps. The tension in the ballroom shifted again. The nobles watched Emily with a new mixture of curiosity and calculation. Some with fear. Some with something far more dangerous. Emily Carter stood in the center of the room with her injured hand still trembling. She realized that her life had already crossed a line she could never return from. And across the marble floor, the Vampire King continued to watch her, as if she had become the most important mystery in his immortal world. The tension in the ballroom did not fade after Lucien Voss gave his command. Instead, it deepened, spreading through the gathered nobles like a slow-moving storm. Emily Carter remained where she stood near the shattered glass, her injured hand trembling slightly as the glowing mark on her palm pulsed with a faint golden warmth. The symbol no longer burned painfully, but it felt alive, as if something ancient had awakened beneath her skin and was quietly waiting. Across the marble floor, the nobles whispered among themselves in low voices, though none dared raise their tone above a murmur after the king had demanded silence. Their eyes moved constantly between Emily and the identical mark resting on Lucien's wrist. Some faces showed fear. Others showed calculation. Emily did not need to understand their world to recognize that look. It was the same expression powerful people used whenever they saw an opportunity or a threat. The tall silver-haired advisor who had spoken earlier returned to the center of the room only a short time later. Walking beside him was an elderly man whose presence immediately changed the atmosphere. He wore a long dark coat that seemed older than the modern ballroom itself. His white hair fell neatly to his shoulders, and thin round glasses rested on the bridge of his nose. Though he appeared human, his calm eyes moved through the room with the quiet certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime studying secrets that most people would never see. The nobles stepped aside respectfully as he approached the king. The old scholar bowed his head slowly. My king, I came as quickly as I could. Lucien Voss extended his arm without a word, revealing the glowing symbol on his wrist. The golden mark shone clearly beneath the lights of the chandelier. The scholar leaned forward, carefully studying the intricate design. His calm expression changed almost immediately. His eyes widened behind the lenses of his glasses. That is impossible, he whispered. The court archives record this symbol only in the oldest volumes. His gaze slowly lifted toward Emily Carter. The young woman felt every eye in the ballroom turn toward her again, as if the air itself had pointed in her direction. The scholar stepped closer, examining the mark on her palm with the same intense focus. For several seconds he said nothing. The silence stretched long enough that Emily could hear the distant hum of the city outside the hotel walls. Finally, the old man straightened and turned toward Lucien. My king, the symbol on your wrist and the one on the girl are identical. This is indeed a Soulmark. A quiet wave of shock passed through the crowd again. One of the nobles near the back spoke in disbelief. But that bond was believed extinct. It belonged to the ancient blood laws. The scholar nodded slowly. That is correct. The Soulmark was created long before the modern vampire houses existed. It was designed by the first councils to bind a ruler to a destined counterpart whose blood carried a specific resonance with the throne itself. Emily struggled to process the words. Destined counterpart. The idea sounded like something from an old legend rather than something happening in front of hundreds of witnesses. A woman near the table spoke sharply. That law was written for royal bloodlines, not for humans. The scholar remained calm as he answered. The texts never specify that the second bearer must be vampire. They only describe a rare blood resonance that can awaken the mark when it touches the king. The room erupted in nervous murmurs. Emily felt her stomach tighten again. She had spent her entire life believing she was ordinary. Her father had worked construction. Her mother had waited tables just like she did. There had never been anything magical about her family. Yet the glowing symbol on her palm continued to pulse softly, as if disagreeing with everything she believed. Lucien Voss finally spoke again. His voice remained calm, but carried an edge of steel. If the mark is real, then the bond is recognized by the throne. The scholar bowed his head once more. Yes, my king. According to the ancient law, the appearance of the Soulmark cannot be undone. It represents a binding fate between the ruler and the one whose blood awakened it. The nobles stared at Emily Carter as if she had just stepped out of a forgotten prophecy. Some looked furious. Others looked terrified. And in the center of the grand ballroom, the waitress with the trembling hand realized that the glowing mark on her skin had just placed her inside the oldest and most dangerous law of the vampire world. The murmurs in the ballroom no longer sounded like simple shock. They sounded like the beginning of a storm. Emily Carter could feel the shift in the room as clearly as a drop in temperature before winter snow. The words of the royal scholar still echoed through the air. The Soulmark cannot be undone. A binding fate between the ruler and the one whose blood awakened it. Those words changed the way every noble in the hall looked at her. Only minutes earlier she had been invisible, a server moving quietly between tables. Now every gaze carried weight. Some of those gazes were calculating, some were openly hostile, and a few were filled with something even more dangerous. Fear. The scholar stepped slightly back from the center of the floor, as if he understood that what came next would no longer belong to quiet academics. A tall noble with dark hair and cold blue eyes stepped forward from the right side of the room. His tailored coat brushed softly against the marble as he approached the king. My king, he said carefully, the ancient law may recognize the mark, but we must also consider the stability of the court. Lucien Voss remained still as stone, but his eyes flicked toward the speaker. The noble continued, his voice calm, but edged with tension. If the mark is legitimate, then this human woman becomes connected to the throne itself. That would place her above every noble house in this room. The words landed like a stone thrown into deep water. The nobles began whispering again, louder this time. Emily felt her chest tighten. Above every noble house. That could not possibly be true. She had spent her entire life worrying about rent payments and grocery bills. The idea that anyone in this room might see her as powerful felt absurd. A sharp voice cut across the rising noise. Unacceptable. The woman in the dark gown stepped forward again, her pale face rigid with anger. This girl has no lineage in our world. No training. No loyalty to the vampire houses. If she truly carries a soul mark, then every enemy of the crown will see her as a weakness. Another noble spoke from the far side of the hall. Or as leverage. A third voice added coldly. Or as a target. Emily swallowed hard. The words hung in the air like knives. Target. The realization spread slowly through her thoughts. If the ancient law connected her to the throne, then she had just become the most vulnerable person in the room. A nobleman with a scar along his jaw leaned toward another guest, whispering something that Emily could not hear clearly, but the final word carried across the floor with chilling clarity. Eliminate. The meaning did not require explanation. Several nobles glanced toward the king, waiting to see his reaction. The silence stretched long enough for the tension to become unbearable. Emily shifted her weight instinctively, stepping backward another small step away from the center of the floor. The movement was enough to trigger a ripple of alert attention from the nearest nobles. Lucien Voss finally moved. He stepped forward with slow, deliberate control. The golden mark on his wrist glowed faintly again, as if responding to the rising conflict in the room. His gaze moved across the gathered nobles one by one. The whispers stopped instantly. The authority in his presence pressed down over the ballroom like a physical force. Anyone who speaks of harming the bearer of my mark will choose their next words carefully. His voice was quiet, but it carried across every corner of the room. No one doubted that the warning was real. The noble with the blue eyes bowed his head slightly. Of course, my king. Our concern is only the safety of the throne, which is exactly why this situation must be handled carefully. If rival houses believe the human woman can influence you, they will act quickly. Lucien's eyes returned to Emily Carter. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily felt as if the entire world had narrowed to that silent connection between them. She had no idea what this mark truly meant. But the look in the Vampire King's eyes told her that whatever destiny had just awakened between them was powerful enough to frighten even the oldest creatures in the room. Behind them, the royal scholar spoke quietly once more. The ancient texts describe another consequence of the soul mark, my king. When the bond awakens, the lives of both bearers become intertwined. Harm to one can echo through the other. A heavy silence followed those words. The meaning was simple. If Emily Carter had become a weakness of the throne, then she had also become something else entirely. The single most dangerous vulnerability the Vampire King had ever possessed. The silence that followed the scholar words did not last long. It shattered the moment the nobles began to truly understand what the soul mark meant. A quiet murmur spread across the ballroom like wind through dry leaves. Emily Carter felt it before she even heard the words. The shift in the room had changed again. The fear that once surrounded her had begun to transform into something sharper and more dangerous. Opportunity. A tall woman with silver hair stepped forward from the far side of the hall. Her gown shimmered like moonlight as she approached the center of the gathering. Her voice was calm, but carried the quiet authority of someone who was used to commanding attention. My king, the ancient law may bind the soul mark, but the law of the houses still governs our world. If the human woman now carries influence over the throne, then the noble houses must protect their interests. Emily did not like the way the woman said protect. It sounded too much like claim. Another noble spoke immediately from the opposite side of the ballroom. His voice was colder and far more direct. The simplest solution is obvious. If the bond creates a vulnerability for the crown, then the human should not be allowed to live long enough to become a weapon against us. Several nobles nodded quietly at the suggestion. The word kill was never spoken, but it did not need to be. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Her fingers curled slightly around her injured palm as the golden mark flickered once again beneath her skin. She had never imagined that a simple accident could place her life in the hands of creatures who debated her fate as if she were a fragile object on a table. Before the tension could explode into open argument, another voice rose from near the king table. A dark-haired noble leaned forward with thoughtful calculation in his eyes. That would be foolish. If the ancient law truly binds their lives together, then harming the girl might harm the king as well. A ripple of unease passed through the nobles as the implications settled in their minds. The royal scholar had already warned them that the soul mark connected the lives of both bearers. Killing Emily Carter might carry consequences none of them could predict. The silver-haired woman folded her arms slowly. Then we do not destroy the asset. We secure it. Her gaze moved across the gathered nobles. The girl should be placed under the authority of a noble house where her actions can be guided and her influence controlled. A low chorus of agreement rose among several members of the court. Emily felt her stomach tighten again. Controlled. Guided. The words sounded like a polite way of describing imprisonment. Another noble spoke from near the back of the room. If the bond is real, then whichever house holds the girl gains direct influence over the king himself. That advantage cannot be ignored. The argument spread quickly as different nobles began speaking over one another. House Blackthorn could offer protection. House Volmir holds the oldest knowledge of blood magic. House Calderon commands the strongest military guard. Each voice carried the same hidden meaning beneath its offer. Claim the girl, and claim the power that comes with her. Emily felt the walls of the ballroom closing around her. The elegant guests no longer looked like wealthy patrons at a charity event. They looked like predators circling prey. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but every exit in the room was already watched by silent guards. At the center of the growing chaos, Lucien Voss had not moved. He listened without interruption as the nobles argued over who should control the human woman standing only a few steps away from him. His expression remained perfectly calm, but the faint glow of the mark on his wrist slowly grew brighter. The room did not notice the change at first, but when the light pulsed once more, several nobles fell silent mid-sentence. Lucien Voss stepped forward. The sound of his shoes touching the marble floor was soft, yet it carried enough weight to command the entire room. The argument stopped immediately. His eyes swept across the gathered houses with quiet authority. You debate ownership of something that does not belong to you. His voice was low, but every word struck the air with absolute certainty. The nobles froze. Lucien then turned toward Emily Carter once more. The golden mark on his wrist pulsed again, answering the identical glow in her palm. She is not an asset to be claimed by any house. The Vampire King paused for a moment, letting the meaning of his words settle across the silent ballroom. She stands under my protection, and anyone who attempts to claim her will answer to me. The declaration from Lucien Voss fell over the ballroom like a sealed command. For a moment no one spoke. The nobles who had been arguing only seconds earlier now stood perfectly still as the meaning of his words settled into the marble hall. She stands under my protection. Emily Carter felt the weight of those words more heavily than anyone else in the room. Protection from the Vampire King himself should have felt reassuring. Instead, it made the entire situation feel even more dangerous. If the most powerful being in the room had to claim her protection so openly, then the threats around her were far worse than she had imagined. The silver-haired woman who had spoken earlier stepped forward again, but this time her voice was carefully measured. My king, no one here would question your authority. Our concern is the balance of power. The appearance of a Soulmark after so many centuries will cause unrest among the houses. There will be those who believe the human woman now holds influence over your decisions. Lucien's eyes remained fixed on her, as if he could see every thought forming behind her calm expression. Let them believe what they wish. His voice did not rise, yet the quiet certainty inside it left no room for argument. The law of the throne stands above the law of the houses. A murmur of reluctant acceptance moved through the court. The nobles understood that challenging the king directly would lead nowhere tonight. But Emily could still feel the tension beneath their silence. These were not creatures who surrendered their ambitions easily. A tall noble with a scar along his jaw folded his arms and spoke slowly. Then perhaps the court should consider another matter. If the Soulmark truly binds their lives together, then the human woman cannot remain outside the protection of the crown. She is now a permanent target for every enemy the throne has ever made. The statement drew quiet nods from several others. Even those who had argued against Emily's existence moments earlier seemed to recognize the truth in that warning. The enemies of the Vampire King were numerous and patient. If they learned that a human woman carried the same ancient mark as their ruler, she would become the most obvious weakness in the entire kingdom. Lucien Voss turned his head slightly toward the royal scholar. Is there any record of how previous Soulmark bearers were protected? The old scholar adjusted his glasses thoughtfully before answering. The historical texts suggest that once the mark appeared, the second bearer was brought under direct royal supervision. In earlier centuries, they would have been moved immediately to the citadel, where the king court could guard them at all times. The citadel. The word passed quietly through the nobles like a memory from another era. Emily had never heard of such a place, but the way several vampires reacted told her it was not simply another building in the city. A younger noble spoke carefully. The citadel has not been used in decades. It is reserved for the highest matters of the crown. Another voice answered from the side of the hall. That is precisely why it is the safest location. Emily felt her chest tighten again. The conversation had shifted from whether she should live to where she should be taken. She had not been asked for her opinion once. Lucien Voss looked at her again, and this time the intensity in his gaze felt almost personal rather than purely political. For a brief moment the room seemed to fade away, leaving only the strange connection created by the glowing marks on their skin. Emily forced herself to speak despite the fear pressing against her throat. I do not understand any of this. Her voice sounded small inside the enormous ballroom, but it was enough to draw every eye back toward her. I am just a waitress. I did not ask for any of this. A few nobles exchanged amused glances at her words, but Lucien's expression did not change. He studied the mark on her palm once more. Neither did I. The quiet honesty of his answer surprised even the court. Then the king straightened and addressed the room once more. The decision is made. The bearer of the Soulmark will be moved to the royal citadel before dawn. There she will remain under my protection until the nature of this bond is fully understood. The nobles remained silent, but Emily could feel their thoughts moving quickly behind their controlled expressions. The game had only begun, and whether she wished it or not, Emily Carter had just been moved to the center of the most dangerous board in the vampire world. The decision of the vampire king echoed through the ballroom long after the words were spoken. The nobles did not argue openly again, but the silence that followed was far from peaceful. Emily Carter could feel it in the way their eyes moved. Some looked thoughtful. Some looked furious. Others looked as if they had already begun calculating their next move. The royal citadel before dawn. The phrase repeated inside her mind as if it belonged to someone else. Only an hour earlier she had been carrying a tray of wine glasses hoping to finish her shift and catch the last subway train home. Now she was being sent to a place she had never even heard of, surrounded by creatures who debated power and bloodlines like ancient kings. Lucien Voss turned slightly toward the royal scholar. Prepare the archives. If the Soulmark has returned, then I want every record of it examined before sunrise. The old scholar bowed his head at once. Of course, my king. There are volumes stored in the deep library that have not been opened in centuries. If the mark has awakened again, then its cause may be hidden there. The silver-haired noblewoman who had spoken earlier folded her arms and watched the exchange carefully. Knowledge will not be enough. If word of this spreads beyond the court, the other clans will react quickly. The appearance of a Soulmark connected to the throne could ignite old rivalries. Lucien's gaze remained calm, but unyielding. Then we will make certain the truth is understood before rumors can distort it. Another noble spoke from near the marble columns. The human woman should not remain here any longer. This gathering is no longer secure. The longer she stands in this room, the more dangerous it becomes for her and for you. Emily could not argue with that logic. The attention of the court pressed against her from every direction like invisible weight. She felt exposed standing beneath the crystal chandeliers with the golden mark glowing faintly on her palm. Lucien looked toward the tall advisor with silver hair. Elias, prepare transport. We leave immediately. The advisor nodded once and turned to speak quietly with several guards stationed near the entrance of the ballroom. They moved with swift efficiency, clearly accustomed to following the king orders without hesitation. Within moments the guards had begun guiding the remaining guests away from the center of the hall. Some nobles departed without a word. Others paused briefly to study Emily Carter with expressions that promised future complications. The woman in the dark gown stopped a few steps away from Emily before leaving. Her pale eyes moved from the glowing mark on Emily's palm to the identical symbol on the king's wrist. Fate can be cruel, she said softly. Be careful that you understand the power you now carry. Emily did not respond. She did not even know what that power truly meant. The woman turned and disappeared into the crowd of departing nobles. Slowly the grand ballroom began to empty, leaving only the king, his advisors, the royal scholar, and a ring of silent guards. The sudden quiet made the enormous room feel even larger than before. Emily shifted, slightly uncertain of where she should stand or what she should do. Lucien Voss approached her with controlled steps. Up close his presence felt even more powerful than it had from across the room. The faint glow of the soul mark on his wrist mirrored the light in her palm, as if the two symbols recognized one another across the small distance between them. "You are injured," he said calmly. Emily looked down at the shallow cut in her hand. The blood had already slowed, but the mark surrounding it still shimmered softly. "I have had worse cuts at work," she replied quietly. The king studied her expression for a moment, as if measuring something deeper than the words she had spoken. "Your life will not resemble that work anymore." The statement was not meant as comfort. It sounded like a simple fact. Emily exhaled slowly. "I was beginning to understand that." Outside the tall windows of the ballroom, the city lights of New York shimmered against the night sky. Somewhere beyond those buildings, trains still moved through tunnels, and people still walked home from ordinary jobs. That world suddenly felt very far away. Elias returned to the king's side. "The vehicles are ready. The road to the citadel is secure." Lucien nodded once. Then he turned his attention back to Emily Carter, the human woman whose blood had awakened the oldest magic in the vampire world. "It is time," he said. And together they walked toward the darkened entrance that would carry her away from the life she had known and into a future neither of them yet understood. The doors of the grand ballroom closed behind them with a deep echo that seemed to seal Emily Carter away from the life she had known only hours earlier. The corridor beyond the hall was quiet and dimly lit with long rows of golden lamps set into dark stone walls. The air felt colder here and far more controlled than the crowded ballroom she had just left behind. Lucien Voss walked ahead with calm, steady steps, while several silent guards moved around them, forming a protective circle. Emily followed, without speaking, though her thoughts raced with questions she did not yet dare to ask. The glowing mark on her palm pulsed faintly with warmth, as if reacting to the presence of the identical symbol on the king's wrist. Each time the light flickered, she felt a strange awareness in the back of her mind. It was not pain. It was more like a distant echo that reminded her that Lucien Voss was only a few steps ahead. They moved through a private elevator hidden behind a steel door at the end of the corridor. Elias pressed a control panel, and the elevator began its silent descent through the lower levels of the building. Emily watched the glowing numbers above the door change slowly, though she barely noticed the passing floors. Her attention kept drifting back to the golden mark in her hand. Finally, she spoke quietly, breaking the silence that had followed them since they left the ballroom. "What exactly is the citadel?" Elias answered before the king could speak. "It is the oldest stronghold of the vampire court in North America. The structure was built long before the modern cities existed. Its location is hidden from human records and protected by centuries of magic and law." Emily absorbed the explanation slowly. "So it is a fortress?" Lucien Voss spoke calmly. "It is the safest place in this world for someone carrying that mark." The elevator doors opened into a secure underground garage where several black vehicles waited with their engines already running. The guards moved quickly, opening the rear door of the nearest vehicle. Lucien entered first, then gestured for Emily to follow. She hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The car door closed with a solid sound that felt final. As the vehicle pulled away from the building, Emily looked back through the tinted glass windows. The bright lights of the hotel faded quickly as the car joined the quiet streets of the late-night city. New York stretched around them with its endless rows of glowing buildings and distant traffic. Yet inside the vehicle, the atmosphere felt strangely separate from the human world outside. Lucien sat across from her, studying the faint light of the soul mark on his wrist. The glow seemed slightly stronger now than it had been inside the ballroom. "The bond grows stronger with proximity," he said quietly, as if answering a question she had not asked aloud. Emily looked down at her own palm. The mark there responded with the same gentle pulse of light. "Does it hurt you?" Lucien shook his head slowly. "No, but it changes things." Outside the window, the tall towers of Manhattan slowly gave way to darker roads leading away from the heart of the city. Emily watched the passing lights blur into streaks of yellow and white as the car accelerated onto a long highway. Elias spoke again from the front seat. "The citadel lies several hours north of the city, hidden in the mountains. The road will be quiet at this hour." Emily leaned back against the leather seat, trying to understand the new direction her life had taken. Hours earlier, she had been worrying about a broken wine glass and an angry manager. Now she was leaving the city entirely with a vampire king whose life was mysteriously connected to her own. Lucien finally lifted his eyes, and met her gaze across the dim interior of the vehicle. There was no hostility in his expression, only a thoughtful curiosity that made Emily uneasy. "Your blood awakened something that has slept for centuries," he said quietly, "until we understand why you are the center of every danger that will follow." Emily held his gaze despite the fear pressing against her thoughts. "I did not choose this." Lucien nodded once. "Neither did I." Outside, the city lights slowly disappeared behind them as the dark road carried them toward the distant mountains where the ancient citadel waited in silence. The highway stretched endlessly through the dark landscape as the vehicle carried them farther away from the city lights. Emily Carter had never traveled this road before. The towering skyline of New York had faded behind them nearly an hour earlier, and now the world outside the tinted windows had changed completely. Tall buildings had been replaced by forests and wide stretches of empty land where only the occasional passing truck disturbed the silence of the night. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere remained calm but tense. The guards sitting in the front seats spoke only when necessary, and their eyes constantly scanned the road ahead. Emily leaned her head slightly toward the window, watching the faint reflection of the golden mark on her palm glowing softly in the glass. Each time the light pulsed, she felt that strange awareness again. It was not a voice, and it was not a thought, but it was unmistakable. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she could sense the presence of Lucien Voss sitting across from her. He seemed to notice the moment her attention shifted toward him. "The bond is beginning to stabilize," he said quietly. Emily looked at him. "Stabilize?" The royal scholar explained that once the Soulmark appears, it begins to synchronize the two bearers. The connection becomes stronger the longer we remain near one another. Emily studied the mark on his wrist, which glowed faintly through the dim light inside the vehicle. "And what happens if we are not near each other?" Lucien's expression remained calm. "According to the ancient records, distance weakens the connection, but it does not break it. The bond remains until one of the bearers dies." The directness of his answer made Emily inhale slowly. "That sounds less like a bond and more like a sentence." Lucien did not disagree. "In many ways it is both." The vehicle slowed slightly as the road began climbing into the mountains. The forest outside grew denser and darker until the moonlight barely reached the ground beneath the tall trees. After another long stretch of winding road, the car passed through a narrow stone gate hidden between two cliffs. Emily noticed the moment they crossed the threshold. The faint glow of the Soulmark on her palm flared brighter for a brief second, as if reacting to the land itself. The guards in the front seats exchanged a quick glance, but said nothing. Elias spoke calmly. "We have entered the outer territory of the citadel." The protective wards recognized the king's presence. Emily leaned forward slightly, trying to see through the windshield. The road continued upward along the side of the mountain until the trees finally opened into a wide stone courtyard carved directly into the rock. At the far end of the clearing stood the citadel itself. Emily had expected something modern or hidden underground, but the structure before her looked ancient and imposing. Massive stone towers rose from the mountainside, connected by thick walls that seemed older than the country itself. Tall iron gates stood open, allowing the vehicle to pass into the inner courtyard where dozens of quiet guards waited in disciplined lines. The car stopped near the entrance, and one of the guards opened the door immediately. Cold mountain air rushed inside, carrying the scent of pine and stone. Emily stepped out slowly, staring up at the towering fortress above her. The citadel looked less like a building and more like a permanent part of the mountain. Lucien stepped out beside her, his dark coat moving slightly in the wind. The faint golden light of the Soulmark reflected briefly against the stone walls before fading again. Several guards approached and bowed their heads respectfully. "The king has returned," one of them said quietly. Lucien nodded once before turning toward Emily. "From this moment forward you remain inside the citadel walls unless I decide otherwise. The security here is stronger than anywhere in the human world." Emily looked up at the towering gates behind them, which were already beginning to close. The heavy iron doors moved slowly, sealing the entrance with a deep echo that rolled through the courtyard. It sounded final. She turned back toward the massive fortress rising above them. "This place feels older than everything I know." Lucien's voice remained steady as he answered. "It is older than most modern history. And somewhere within these walls lies the answer to why your blood awakened the oldest magic my kind has ever known." The iron gates of the citadel finished closing behind them with a deep thunder that echoed across the stone courtyard. Emily Carter turned slowly as the sound faded into the cold mountain air. For a moment, she felt as if the entire world outside those walls had disappeared. The city lights of New York were gone. The noise of traffic and human life had been replaced by the quiet discipline of the fortress surrounding her. Rows of guards stood motionless along the courtyard walls, their dark uniforms blending with the shadows cast by the tall stone towers. Every one of them watched the king with absolute attention. Lucien Voss began walking toward the entrance of the citadel without hesitation. His presence alone seemed to guide the movement of everyone around him. The guards stepped aside instantly as he passed, and several bowed their heads in silent respect. Emily followed a step behind, unsure of where she should stand in this strange new world. The faint golden mark on her palm pulsed again, reacting to the identical glow on the king's wrist. Each pulse reminded her that no matter how far she had traveled, the bond between them had not weakened. They passed through the massive stone doors of the fortress and entered a vast hall carved directly from the mountain itself. The ceiling rose high above them, supported by enormous pillars of dark granite. Long banners hung between the columns, each marked with ancient symbols that Emily could not recognize. Torches burned steadily along the walls, casting warm light across the stone floor. The entire place felt older than any building she had ever seen. Elias walked ahead to speak quietly with another guard waiting near the base of the stairs. The guard listened carefully before hurrying away toward a narrow corridor that disappeared deeper into the fortress. Lucien slowed his steps slightly, allowing Emily to walk beside him rather than behind him. "You will stay in the East Wing," he said calmly. "Those chambers are secure and close to the royal library." Emily glanced around the enormous hall. "The place feels more like a castle than a house." Lucien nodded once. "The citadel has defended the vampire court for centuries. It was built to survive wars that most of the modern world has forgotten." Emily absorbed that quietly. The golden mark on her palm flickered again, though this time the sensation felt slightly different. Warmer. Almost as if the connection between them had settled into a steady rhythm now that they stood inside the citadel walls. At the far end of the hall, a group of advisors approached quickly. The royal scholar stood among them, holding several old leather-bound books against his chest. His expression carried the focused excitement of someone who had discovered a mystery worth an entire lifetime of study. "My king," he said respectfully, "I have already begun examining the earliest records of the Soulmark. There are references and texts older than the citadel itself." Lucien stopped beside the base of the wide staircase and listened. "What have you found?" The scholar opened one of the books, carefully revealing pages covered in faded ink and intricate symbols. The earliest accounts described the Soulmark as more than a bond. It was meant to guide the throne during times of great danger. The mark would only awaken when the blood of a specific lineage touched the king. Emily felt her attention sharpen immediately. Specific lineage. She had grown up believing her family history was simple and ordinary. The scholar continued speaking while scanning the ancient text. According to these records, the bearer of the second mark was never random. Their blood carried something rare that could change the future of the vampire court. The advisors around him exchanged uneasy looks. One of them spoke cautiously. "That sounds less like a coincidence and more like a prophecy." The scholar nodded slowly. In some of the oldest scrolls, the Soulmark is described as the return of a forgotten bloodline. A bloodline that once shaped the balance between humans and vampires long before the modern era began. Emily stared at the ancient pages in the scholar's hands, trying to understand what those words meant for her. Lucien studied her expression for a moment before looking back at the scholar. "Then we begin with her family history. The answer to this mystery is already written somewhere in the past. And tonight we begin uncovering it." The vast hall of the citadel remained quiet long after the royal scholar finished speaking. The ancient books in his hands seemed to carry a weight far greater than their pages. Emily Carter stood near the base of the great staircase, trying to absorb what she had just heard. A forgotten bloodline. A prophecy tied to the Soulmark. None of it sounded like something that could belong to her life. Only yesterday her greatest concern had been whether she could cover next month's rent and avoid another argument with her restaurant manager. Now an entire court of ancient creatures believed her blood carried something powerful enough to awaken magic older than their kingdom. The royal scholar closed the book slowly, as if careful not to disturb the fragile pages. The records suggest that the bloodline connected to the Soulmark once served as a bridge between the vampire throne and the human world. These individuals were rare, and their existence was kept secret even during the earliest years of the court. One of the advisors spoke quietly. Why hide them? If they were so important, then their bloodline should have been protected. The scholar adjusted his glasses thoughtfully. The text suggests that protecting them was precisely the problem. Once other factions discovered the influence such a bloodline could hold over the throne, they became targets. Some were hunted. Others disappeared. Over time, the line was believed to have vanished entirely. Emily felt a cold wave of realization move through her chest. If that bloodline truly existed, then somewhere in the distant past her family must have been connected to it. She tried to imagine her parents being part of some hidden history tied to vampires and ancient laws, but the idea felt almost impossible. Lucien Voss studied her expression with quiet focus. The golden mark on his wrist pulsed gently in response to the matching light on her palm. Your reaction tells me you did not know anything about this history. Emily shook her head slowly. My parents never mentioned anything like that. My father worked construction and my mother waited tables just like I do. They lived ordinary lives. The scholar stepped closer with careful curiosity. Sometimes the safest way to protect a bloodline is to allow it to forget what it truly is. He opened another of the ancient books and scanned the faded writing across its pages. According to this record, the final known bearer of the lineage disappeared more than 100 years ago. After that, there are no confirmed accounts of the bloodline continuing. Emily exhaled quietly. Until tonight. The scholar nodded once. Until tonight. The advisors exchanged uneasy looks. One of them spoke cautiously to the king. If the bloodline has truly returned, then the political consequences could be enormous. Rival clans will not ignore this discovery once they learn about it. Lucien's voice remained calm but firm. They will not learn anything until we understand the truth ourselves. Emily studied the glowing mark in her palm again. The warmth of it no longer felt foreign. It felt strangely steady, like a quiet heartbeat beneath her skin. She looked at Lucien across the stone floor. What happens now? The king considered the question for a moment before answering. Now we learn who you really are. His gaze moved briefly toward the royal scholar. Begin tracing her family history. Every record. Every name. I want to know where this bloodline survived and how it reached her. The scholar bowed his head respectfully. I will begin immediately, my king. The advisors slowly dispersed, leaving the vast hall quieter once again. The torches along the stone walls flickered softly, as if reacting to the faint pulse of the ancient magic now present inside the citadel. Lucien turned back toward Emily, his expression thoughtful but steady. You said earlier that you did not choose this path. Emily nodded slightly, remembering her own words. That has not changed. Lucien's voice lowered just enough that only she could hear it. Yet somehow fate chose both of us anyway. The soul mark between them pulsed again, casting a brief golden reflection across the stone floor. For the first time since the accident in the ballroom, Emily began to understand that whatever destiny had awakened in her blood would shape not only her life, but the future of the entire vampire court. The torches along the walls of the citadel burned quietly as the great hall slowly emptied. Advisors and scholars disappeared into shadowed corridors carrying ancient books and fragile scrolls that had not been opened in generations. Their task had already begun. Somewhere deep within the fortress, they would search through centuries of forgotten records, trying to uncover the truth about the bloodline that had awakened the Soulmark. Emily Carter remained near the base of the wide stone staircase, watching the last of them leave. The massive hall felt even larger now that the voices had faded. Only the steady glow of the torches and the faint pulse of golden light from her palm remained. Lucien Voss stood several steps away, studying the same symbol on his wrist. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It felt more like the quiet pause that follows a great storm when the world is trying to understand what has changed. Emily finally looked up at him. When you first saw the mark appear, did you know what it meant? Lucien answered without hesitation. I knew it was ancient. I did not know it was yours. Emily lowered her eyes again to the glowing symbol. It had once felt frightening and unfamiliar, but now the warmth inside the mark felt steady and calm. It no longer pulsed with chaos. Instead, it felt as if it had settled into its rightful place beneath her skin. The royal scholar returned a short time later carrying one final document. His expression showed the quiet satisfaction of a man who had found the missing piece of a long-forgotten puzzle. "My king, I believe we have our answer." Lucian motioned for him to continue. The scholar opened the fragile parchment, revealing a faded illustration of the same golden symbol that now glowed on both of their hands. Beneath the drawing was a name written in old script. The final records confirm it. The lost bloodline served as guardians of balance between the human world and the vampire throne. When the Soulmark awakened, the bearer was not meant to rule the throne, but to guide it. Emily listened carefully as the meaning of the words settled into her thoughts. Guide it. Lucian's voice was calm when he spoke again. Then the purpose of the bond was never about power. It was about balance. The scholar nodded. Precisely, my king. The bloodline was meant to remind the throne that even immortal rulers must remain connected to the world they protect. Without that balance, the old texts warned that the vampire court would eventually fall into darkness. Emily felt a quiet realization unfold in her chest. All her life, she had believed she was ordinary. Yet somehow her blood carried a role that had existed long before she was born. Lucian turned toward her again. His expression was no longer guarded with suspicion or political caution. Instead, there was something steadier in his gaze. Respect. Then the mystery is resolved, he said quietly. The Soulmark returned because the court needed the balance it once lost. Emily looked at the towering walls of the citadel surrounding them. And what happens now? Lucian answered simply. Now we build a future that remembers both worlds. The golden light of the Soulmark pulsed once more across their hands, but this time it felt calm and complete. The ancient bond had awakened not as a curse or a chain, but as a promise. A promise that the throne of the vampire king would never again rule without the wisdom of the human world beside it. And in the quiet halls of the ancient citadel, Emily Carter, the waitress who never expected her life to change, had become the living bridge between two worlds that had forgotten how to stand together.